The judgment was as cold and unyielding as the black marble of the throne room. It echoed in the cavernous space, a pronouncement that sealed a fate and broke a world in two. Alaric, king of the Nighthaven court, sat upon the obsidian throne, the weight of 1,000 years of lineage pressing down on his shoulders like a physical shroud. His face, carved from the same pale stone as the statues of his ancestors that lined the hall, was a mask of regal indifference. But beneath the placid surface, his immortal heart, a thing that should have been beyond such mortal frailties, was fracturing. The royal physicians and the seers of the Blood Moon Coven are in accord, Your Majesty, Lord Valerus intoned, his voice slick with a sycophantic reverence that barely concealed the triumph in his eyes. The human consort, Lyra, is barren. She cannot carry the royal line. Barren. The word was a poison dart. It struck the air and hung there, venomous and absolute. Alaric's gaze drifted to Lyra. She stood before the throne, flanked by two of his royal guard, their polished silver armor a stark contrast to her simple woolen dress. She was not weeping. Her chin was high, her back a straight, defiant line against the crushing weight of their condemnation. Her eyes, the color of a forest floor in autumn, were fixed on his. They were not pleading. They were searching, asking a question he could not, would not, answer. He had loved her. The thought was a treason in this moment of cold duty. He had loved the warmth of her skin against his perpetually cool flesh, the sound of her laughter in the desolate corridors of his castle, the way she saw not a king, but a man. For a brief, sun-drenched season, she had made him forget the endless, lonely night of his existence. But love was a luxury. Lineage was a mandate. His father's dying words had been a command, not a request. The bloodline is eternal, Alaric. It is all that matters. The court watched him, a gallery of ancient, predatory faces. They had never approved of his choice. A human queen? A fleeting, fragile creature to share the throne of an immortal king? They saw her as a dalliance, a temporary madness. Now, her perceived failure was their vindication. He could feel their collective will, a palpable pressure in the air, demanding he excise this human weakness from their court, from his heart. He had to choose. The king he was born to be, or the man Lyra had made him. The choice was no choice at all. It had been made for him a millennium ago. The law is clear, Alaric said, his voice a low, chilling monotone that betrayed none of the storm raging within him. Each word was a betrayal, a stone laid on the tomb of his own happiness. A consort who cannot secure the succession is a threat to the stability of the kingdom. She has failed in her sacred duty. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes then, a brief, unguarded tremor. It was not the verdict that wounded her, he knew. It was the source. It was him. He was wielding the knife. Lyra of the sunken valleys, he declared, rising from the throne, his crimson-lined cape settling around him like wings of blood and shadow. For this failure, you are stripped of all titles and protections of the crown. You are hereby exiled from the kingdom of Nighthaven, to be cast out into the wildlands beyond the Shadowfen Pass. You will leave at dawn. None shall offer you aid, on pain of death. A collective, satisfied sigh rippled through the court. Valerus bowed low, a serpent coiling in triumph. Lyra did not move. She simply held his gaze, and in that final, silent communion, he saw not hatred, but a profound and devastating pity. It was a look that said, "You poor, trapped thing. You have just exiled the only part of yourself that was ever free." He turned away, unable to bear it, and swept from the throne room, the sound of his boots on the marble floor the lonely tolling of a funeral bell. He did not see them drag her away. He did not watch her forced march to the gates at dawn, clad in rags, with nothing but a small satchel of dried rations. He locked himself in his chambers, the crown resting heavy on a velvet cushion, its silver gleaming like a cage. He told himself it was duty. He told himself it was necessity. He told himself he was a king, and kings made sacrifices. But as the sun, an entity he could not face, rose over his kingdom, all he could hear was the shattering of his own soul, a sound no one else in his silent, eternal world would ever hear. He had chosen his lineage over his love, and in doing so, had condemned himself to a reign as cold and barren as the future they had falsely pinned upon her. The next 5 years were a study in hollow victory. Alaric ruled with an iron fist and a heart encased in ice. He expanded his territories, crushed rebellions with merciless efficiency, and filled the royal coffers until they overflowed with the wealth of conquered lands. The court whispered of his power, his ruthlessness, his utter dedication to the throne. They called him Alaric the Great, Alaric the Unyielding. He was everything his ancestors had demanded he be, a king of immense and terrible power. And he was utterly, devastatingly alone. The castle, once filled with the phantom echo of Lyra's laughter, was now tomb-silent. The warmth she had brought into his life had long since dissipated, leaving behind a cold that seeped into the very stones. He found himself wandering the halls at night, a ghost in his own home, his hand tracing the cold silk of the tapestries she had loved, his gaze lingering on the empty space in the gardens where she had once grown moonpetal flowers. The emptiness was a physical presence, a constant companion that sat with him on the throne and lay beside him in his vast, cold bed. His lineage was secure in its power, but the future he had sacrificed her for felt like a desolate wasteland stretching into an endless eternity. His obsession with the wildlands grew. The vast, untamed forest beyond the kingdom's edge became a fixation. It was the place he had sent her to die, and it called to him with a morbid fascination. He began to lead hunting parties into its shadowed depths, pushing deeper than any of his guards thought wise. They hunted fell beasts and shadow cats, creatures of nightmare that tested his immortal strength. But Alaric was not hunting for sport. He was hunting for penance, for a ghost. He was chasing a memory into the one place he knew it had ended. On the 5th anniversary of her exile, he rode out alone. He dismissed his guards at the Shadowfen Pass, ignoring their worried protests. The King of Nighthaven does not fear shadows, he had told them, his voice clipped and final. But it was a lie. He was terrified of the shadows inside him. The wildlands were ancient and alive. The trees were titans, their canopy so thick that the forest floor lived in a perpetual twilight. Strange, luminous fungi pulsed with soft light on the bark of fallen logs, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decay, and something else, something primal and watchful. For hours, he rode, letting his black warhorse pick its way through the tangled undergrowth. He was not tracking any beast. He was simply moving, a king without a kingdom, a man adrift in a sea of his own making. It was near dusk when the attack came. There was no sound, no warning. The shadows beneath a gnarled oak simply deepened, coalesced, and lunged. A shadow beast. It was a creature of pure nightmare, all teeth and claws and shifting darkness, its form barely solid. Its eyes were embers burning in a void. Alaric's horse screamed and reared, throwing him to the ground. He rolled, his silver sword, whisper, already in his hand, the ancient metal humming with power. The beast was impossibly fast. It swiped at him, its claws leaving gouges in the ancient earth where his head had been moments before. Alaric was a warrior of 1,000 years, his movements a blur of deadly grace, but the beast was a creature of the wilds, born of its raw, chaotic magic. It gave no ground. It felt no pain. It was a force of nature, and he was trespassing in its domain. He parried a blow that would have torn a mortal man in half, the impact jarring his arm to the shoulder. He spun, driving Whisper toward the creature's core, but the blade passed through the shifting darkness with little effect. He was tiring, his immortal stamina being drained by the beast's relentless assault. It backed him against the colossal trunk of an ironwood tree, its burning eyes filled with a malevolent hunger. It gathered itself for a final, killing pounce, the very air growing cold around it. Alaric braced himself, his jaw set. He had faced down armies and dragons. To die here, alone, in the forest where he had sent her, felt like a grim, fitting poetry. And then, a voice. Small, clear, and ringing with an impossible authority. Stop. The word was not a plea. It was a command. The shadow beast, coiled in mid-air, froze. The darkness of its form seemed to ripple, to recoil, as if struck by a physical blow. Alaric stared, his breath catching in his chest. From the dense brush to his left, a small figure emerged. It was a child, a girl of no more than 4 or 5 years, with a wild tangle of dark hair and a smudged face. She wore a simple tunic of patched leather and hide. She was small, impossibly so against the backdrop of the monstrous beast, but she stood with a stillness, a presence, that defied her size. She took another step forward, her bare feet silent on the mossy ground. She raised a tiny hand. "Go," she said, her voice soft but absolute. The shadow beast let out a low, guttural whine, a sound of pain and fear. The darkness that formed its body dissolved, turning to smoke and vapor, until nothing was left but the two burning embers of its eyes, which faded into the twilight. Silence descended upon the clearing, thick and profound. Alaric remained frozen, his sword still raised, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. A child had commanded a creature of pure nightmare, and it had obeyed. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his immortal heart stopped. Her eyes. They were wide, luminous, and the precise, unmistakable silver of the royal bloodline of Nighthaven. His eyes. The rustle of leaves behind the child made him flinch. A woman stepped out of the shadows, moving with the fluid grace of a hunter. She was taller, leaner than he remembered, her skin tanned by the sun and her arms corded with muscle. Her dark hair was braided back from a face that was all sharp angles and fierce intensity. In her hands, she held a yew bow, an arrow narked and aimed directly at his heart. His world, which had been fracturing for 5 years, finally shattered into dust. It was Lyra. The arrow was a sliver of sharpened flint, fletched with raven feathers. It was aimed with a steadiness that spoke of years of practice, of a life dependent on the certainty of her shot. Lyra's face was a mask of cold fury, her knuckles white where she gripped the bow. The woman who stood before him was not the gentle consort he had exiled. This was a survivor, a predator forged in the crucible of the wildlands. Her eyes, those warm, autumn-brown eyes that had once looked at him with such love, were now as hard and unforgiving as the stone tip of her arrow. "Memar," the little girl said, her voice a stark contrast to the lethal tension in the air. She looked from the spot where the beast had vanished to the tall, silver-clad man, and then back to her mother. Lyra's gaze never left Alaric's. "Stay behind me, Ilara," she commanded, her voice low and tight. Ilara. The name was a whisper of his own. A new crack formed in the collapsing ruin of his soul. He looked from Lyra's unforgiving face to the child peeking out from behind her mother's leg. The child with his eyes. Silver eyes, the undeniable mark of the royal vampire lineage, a trait so dominant it appeared in every sign of his house, no matter how diluted the blood. It was a biological certainty, an immutable fact of their existence. A human mate could only bear a child with those eyes if the father was of his line. He was the last of his line. The physicians. The seers. Barren. The word echoed in his mind, no longer a judgment, but a lie. A monstrous, world-altering lie. They had lied to him. Valerus, with his triumphant, serpent smile. The Coven, with their solemn, false pronouncements. They had conspired to rob him of this. Of her. Of his daughter. He had banished his pregnant wife. He had sent her, carrying his child, into this deadly wilderness to die. The weight of that realization was absolute. It was heavier than his crown, heavier than his kingdom, heavier than a millennium of existence. It crushed the air from his lungs. The strength fled his limbs, his immortal power draining away into the cold, damp earth. Whisper, his ancestral sword, the symbol of his power and his reign, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It was the instrument of a tyrant, the tool of a fool. With a clatter that sounded deafeningly loud in the sudden silence of the forest, he let it fall from his numb fingers. It landed in the moss, its silver gleam instantly tarnished by the dirt. It was a surrender. Complete. Unconditional. Lyra's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She had expected a fight, a demand, a king's righteous anger. She had not expected this. This brokenness. Alaric took a half-step forward, his hands raised, palms open, in a gesture of peace, of utter capitulation. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice raw, scraped hollow by the magnitude of his sin. The name felt like a prayer and a curse on his tongue. "Don't," she hissed, the bowstring tightening. "Don't you dare say my name." The little girl, Ilara, watched him, her silver eyes wide with a child's unfiltered curiosity, untouched by the venomous history that stood between her parents. She saw not a king or a monster, but a tall, sad man who looked at her as if she were a star that had fallen from the sky. She has your eyes, Alaric whispered, the words barely audible. It was not a question. It was a confession of his own blindness. She has my strength, Lyra retorted, her voice shaking with a rage that had been simmering for 5 long years. No thanks to you. I kept her alive. I protected her from the monsters in this forest. And from the monster who sent us here. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow, and he accepted them all. He deserved them. He deserved more. He deserved the arrow poised at his heart. He looked at the child, his child, a miracle he had thrown away. He saw the patched leather of her tunic, the smudges of dirt on her cheeks, the wildness in her hair. She should have been in a palace, dressed in silks, safe and cherished. Instead, he had condemned her to this. Condemned them both. The arrogance of his grief, the self-pity he had wallowed in for 5 years, evaporated, revealing the ugly truth beneath. He was not the victim of his duty. He was the perpetrator of a monstrous cruelty. He had not sacrificed his happiness for his kingdom, he had sacrificed his family for his pride. Slowly, deliberately, he sank to his knees in the damp moss. The king of Nighthaven, a monarch before whom armies trembled, knelt in the dirt before the exiled woman he had wronged and the unknown daughter he had forsaken. He bowed his head, the silver circlet he wore catching the dim light. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not beg or plead or demand. There were no words for the depth of his transgression. There was only this gesture. The bended knee of a broken king. He remained there, motionless, waiting for the arrow. Waiting for the justice he had denied her for so long. The forest held its breath around them, the ancient trees silent witnesses to the undoing of a king. He had come into the wildlands seeking a ghost, a penance for a crime he thought he understood. He had found a truth 1,000 times worse, a living, breathing testament to his failure, with his own silver eyes. And in that moment, kneeling in the dirt, he knew he would never be the same. The king was dead. The man, or what was left of him, had to find a way to live with what he had done. The arrow did not come. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the chirping of some unseen nightbird. After a long moment, Alaric lifted his head. Lyra had not lowered the bow, but the killing tension had eased from her shoulders. Her expression was no longer pure fury, it was a maelstrom of confusion, pain, and a deep, weary caution. She had prepared for a fight, for a tyrant come to drag her and her child back as curiosities or prisoners. She had not prepared for a king on his knees. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice hard, brittle. He did not rise. "Nothing," he said, his own voice sounding foreign to him, stripped of all its regal authority. "I want nothing from you." He looked at Alara, who was now clutching her mother's tunic, her silver eyes fixed on him. I did not know." "You did not care to know," Lyra corrected him, the truth of her words a physical sting. "You listened to whispers and lies because it was easier. You chose your throne over your wife. That is what I know." He could not deny it. He did not try. "Yes," he said simply. The admission hung in the air between them. She finally lowered the bow, though she did not knock the arrow. It was a concession, not a truce. "Go back to your kingdom, Alaric. There is nothing for you here." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "My kingdom is where you are." The words were not a lover's plea, but a statement of fact, a truth that had just dawned on him with the force of a physical blow. "I am not leaving." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. "You are not welcome. This is our home. The home you condemned us to." "I know," he said. "I will not enter it. I will not trouble you. But I will not leave you unguarded. Not again." He looked past her to the small, sturdy shelter built into the side of a moss-covered hillock, a home made of woven branches, mud, and stone. Smoke curled lazily from a hole in its roof. It was a testament to her strength, her resilience. She had not just survived, she had built a life from the ashes of the one he had burned. Without another word, he rose to his feet. Not as a king, but as something lesser. He walked to the edge of the small clearing, a respectful distance from her dwelling, and began to make his camp. He did not use magic. He gathered fallen branches for a fire with his own hands, his fine leather gloves soon scuffed and torn. He unstrapped the bedroll from his horse and laid it on the cold ground. He moved with a slow, methodical purpose, every action and articulation of his intent. He was not a king claiming territory. He was a supplicant at the gates. Lyra watched him, her bow held loosely at her side, her face a mask of disbelief. She ushered Elara inside their home, but she remained in the doorway, a silent, wary sentinel. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the deep, dangerous dark of the wildlands fell. The night came alive with unseen sounds, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of a forest wolf, the rustle of something large moving through the undergrowth. For 5 years, she had faced this darkness alone. Every night was a vigil, every sound a potential threat to her child. Tonight, for the first time, she was not alone. Across the clearing, a fire sparked to life, casting a warm, flickering glow. Beside it sat the king who had banished her, his silver sword laid aside, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the oppressive darkness of the surrounding woods. He was a silhouette against the flames, a statue of vigilance. He was not resting. He was watching. He was guarding. The vigil began that night. It stretched into days, then weeks, then months. Alaric did not speak to them unless spoken to first. He did not approach their home. He became a silent, constant presence at the edge of their lives. His routine was simple and unvarying. At dawn, he would leave the camp. He would return hours later, leaving a fresh kill, a brace of rabbits, a small deer, at a designated spot halfway between his camp and their shelter. He would then retreat to his fire and resume his watch. He was a king, a being of immense power and wealth, yet he lived as a wildling. His fine clothes became tattered and stained. His hair grew long and unkempt. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw. He grew thinner, the sharp planes of his face more pronounced, but his eyes, when they chanced to meet Lyra's, held a clarity she had never seen in them before. The cold arrogance of the monarch was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding sorrow and a fierce, unwavering purpose. Elara was the first to bridge the chasm between them. Children lack the patience for protracted sieges of emotion. To her, the sad man with the silver eyes who brought them food and kept the scary night sounds away was a source of endless fascination. One afternoon, while Lyra was tanning a hide, Elara toddled out of the shelter and walked directly toward Alaric's camp. Lyra's heart leaped into her throat. She shot to her feet, calling her daughter's name, but Elara paid her no mind. She stopped just before the circle of stones that marked his fire pit and stood there, studying him. Alaric had been sharpening a stake, but he went utterly still at her approach. He did not move, did not speak, letting the child make the first move. He looked like a man holding his breath before a god. Elara pointed a small, grubby finger at the silver circlet that still rested on his brow. "Shiny," she said, her voice clear as a bell. A sound escaped Alaric's throat, something between a choked laugh and a sob. Slowly, reverently, he reached up and removed the circlet. It was the lesser crown of Nighthaven, a symbol of his authority even outside the castle walls. He held it out to her on his open palm. She took it, her small hands turning it over and over, her reflection warping in the polished metal. She looked from the crown to his face. "You're the king," she stated, not with awe, but with the simple certainty of a child naming a thing. She had heard her mother's bitter stories, whispered into the fire on lonely nights. "I was," Alaric said, his voice thick with emotion. Elara seemed to consider this. Then, she did something that shattered the last of his defenses. She walked forward, stood on her tiptoes, and placed the circlet clumsily back on his head. "It's yours," she said, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she patted his knee before turning and running back to her mother. Alaric did not move for a long time after she left. He simply sat there, his head bowed, his hand covering his eyes. When he finally looked up, his gaze met Lyra's across the clearing. For the first time in 5 years, she did not look away. She saw not the king who had condemned her, but the man her daughter had just crowned. The ice around her heart did not melt, but for the first time, she felt the faintest of cracks appear. The seasons in the wildlands were unforgiving. Summer bled into a wet, cold autumn, and the nights grew longer, deeper. A sickness came with the chill rains, a fever that swept through the forest, sickening the animals and tainting the water. One evening, Elara began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that sent a spear of fear through Lyra's heart. By morning, the child was burning with fever, her small body trembling beneath a pile of furs. Lyra tried every remedy she knew, a tea of willow bark, a cool compress for her forehead, but the fever only climbed. Elara grew listless, her silver eyes clouded with pain. Lyra was frantic, her carefully constructed world of self-reliance crumbling around her. She was a skilled hunter, a survivor, but she was not a healer. The terror of her own inadequacy was a cold knot in her stomach. For 2 days, she fought it alone, her pride a bitter pill in her mouth. She would not ask him for help. She would not. But on the third night, as Elara's breathing grew shallow and ragged, Lyra's pride shattered. Her daughter was dying. Nothing else mattered. Leaving the child's side for a moment, she ran from the shelter, her bare feet splashing through the cold mud. "Alaric," she screamed, her voice tearing through the night. He was there in an instant, moving with supernatural speed, his face etched with alarm. "What is it? What's wrong?" "It's Elara," she sobbed, the words tumbling out. "The fever. I don't know what to do. She's not getting better." Without hesitation, he swept past her and into the shelter. It was the first time he had crossed the threshold. The small space was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. He knelt beside the small pallet where Elara lay, his large hand gently touching her forehead. He flinched at the heat. "There is a flower," he said, his voice urgent. "King's Ember. It grows only on the high, sun-facing cliffs of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, miles from here. Its petals, when crushed into a paste, can break any fever." "I can't leave her," Lyra cried, her despair absolute. "You won't have to," he said, his silver eyes meeting hers. "I will go." The Dragon's Tooth Mountains were treacherous, a place of sheer cliffs and vicious winds, home to rock ghouls and other foul creatures. For a mortal, the journey would take a week. "You won't make it in time," she whispered, her last hope dying. "I am not a mortal," he reminded her gently. He stood, his expression grim with determination. "Stay with her. Keep her warm. I will be back before sunrise." And then he was gone, a blur of shadow moving out into the night, faster than any horse, faster than any wolf. Lyra was left alone in the shelter, the space still seeming to hold the echo of his presence. She had let him in. She had placed her daughter's life in his hands, the hands of the man who had once cast them out. She returned to Elara's side, her heart a tangled knot of fear, hope, and a bewildering, reluctant trust. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. Elara's fever raged, and she began to murmur in her sleep, small, incoherent sounds that tore at Lyra's soul. Lyra held her daughter's hand, whispering stories, singing lullabies, her voice a thin, wavering thread in the vast, dark silence. Just as the first hint of grey light touched the eastern sky, he returned. He did not enter but stood at the doorway, his figure dark against the dawn. He was covered in scrapes and cuts, his tunic torn, a deep gash on his cheek still weeping dark, sluggish blood. But in his hand, he held a single, radiant flower. It glowed with a soft, internal heat, its petals the color of a dying fire. King's Ember. He had done it. He had crossed the impassable mountains in a single night. He held the flower out to her, his hand trembling slightly from exhaustion. She took it, their fingers brushing for the first time in over 5 years. His skin was cold, as she remembered, but the touch sent a jolt of warmth through her. She quickly crushed the petals, mixing them with a little water to form a thick paste. With a gentle hand, she applied it to Elara's lips. The child, even in her fevered state, swallowed it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a deep sigh shuddered through Elara's small body. The frantic heat began to recede from her skin. Her breathing eased, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of a peaceful sleep. The fever had broken. Lyra slumped to the floor, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful it left her weak. Tears streamed down her face, tears of terror vanquished, of a gratitude so profound it hurt. She looked at Alaric, who still stood in the doorway, watching them, his face a ruin of exhaustion and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small, inadequate. He simply nodded, his silver eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name. He had not done it for her forgiveness. He had not done it to prove a point. He had done it for his daughter. He had faced down a mountain and its monsters to save the child he had almost lost forever. He turned to leave, to return to his lonely vigil, but Lyra's voice stopped him. "Stay," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The fire is warm. You should rest." It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was an invitation. It was a beginning. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then slowly, stiffly, he stepped inside and sat by the fire, finally bringing his warmth into their home. The act of service, the desperate race against death, had changed something fundamental between them. It had proven that his vigil was not a performance. It was a vow. But Alaric knew that guarding them, even saving them, was not enough. Penance was more than protection. It required justice. He had been betrayed, yes, but he had been a willing fool, too blinded by pride and tradition to question the verdict against the woman he claimed to love. The rot had started in his court, with the counselors who had whispered poison in his ear. To truly cleanse his soul, he had to first cleanse his kingdom. One morning, Lyra awoke to find his camp empty. The fire was cold, his bedroll gone. A cold spike of fear, sharp and familiar, pierced her heart. Had he left? Had this all been some elaborate game, and having finally earned a sliver of her trust, he had grown bored and returned to his real life? The old wound, the one carved by his abandonment, tore open anew. She spent the day on edge, her gaze constantly drawn to the empty space where his fire had been, a hollow ache settling in her chest. Ilara, too, was quiet, asking where the sad king had gone. For 6 days, there was nothing. The silence of the forest pressed in again, heavier than before. Lyra found herself missing the quiet certainty of his presence, the knowledge that just beyond her sight, he was watching over them. She hated herself for the feeling, for the dependency he had so carefully, so patiently, cultivated. On the evening of the 7th day, he returned. He did not come from the direction of the forest path, but from the main road that led back to Nighthaven. He was not alone. He led his black warhorse, and slung across its back were heavy, grim-looking sacks. He was dressed once more in his black and silver armor, cleaned and polished, and Whisper was strapped to his waist. He looked every inch the king, and Lyra's heart sank. He had come to take them, to force them back. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and dismounted, his movements weary but deliberate. He did not look at her but began to untie the ropes holding the sacks. Lyra grabbed her bow, her hand automatically reaching for an arrow. Ilara hid behind her, peeking out with wide, frightened eyes. Alaric lifted the first sack. It was heavy, and it dripped a dark, viscous fluid onto the forest floor. With a grunt, he appended it. A head, pale and waxy in the twilight, rolled out onto the grass. Its eyes were open in a final expression of shock, its mouth agape. "Lord Valerus." Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Alaric did not pause. He emptied the second sack. And the third. And the fourth. Until a ghastly semicircle of severed heads lay in the dirt before him. She recognized them all. The 4 high counselors who had sat in judgment of her. The seers of the Blood Moon Coven. The royal physicians. All of them. He finally looked at her, his face grim, his silver eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. There was blood on his gauntlets. "They lied," he said, his voice low and resonant with a terrible finality. "They confessed, before the end. They feared a human queen, feared a half-blood heir. They conspired to remove you. To preserve what they called the purity of the line," he gestured to the grisly display with a sweep of his hand. "This was their price. This is the beginning of my atonement." Lyra stared, horrified and yet, vindicated. This was not the act of a politician or a diplomat. This was the act of a predator, a king of an ancient and brutal line. It was savage. It was absolute. And it was, in his own terrible language, an act of love. He had not just punished her enemies, he had ripped out the diseased heart of his own court. He had torn down the very system that had demanded her sacrifice. He was showing her, in the only way he knew how, that he was destroying the king he had been, piece by bloody piece. He took a step forward, his armor clinking softly. I have dismantled the old council. I have broken the coven. I have purged the court of every sycophant and traitor who stood by and watched you be condemned. He stopped, his gaze holding hers, raw and vulnerable. The throne is empty, Lyra. The kingdom is bleeding. It needs a true queen. Not a consort. A queen. To rule beside me. As my equal. He was not commanding her. He was asking. He had brought her justice, laid at her feet in blood and bone, and now he was offering her a kingdom. Her kingdom. Ilara, who had been hiding, stepped forward. She looked at the terrible heads on the ground, but her child's mind did not seem to register the horror. She saw only that her father had returned. She ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his armored leg. You came back, she said, her voice muffled against the cold metal. Alaric flinched, as if her innocent touch burned him. Slowly, carefully, he reached down and placed a hand on her head, his blood-stained gauntlet a stark contrast to her dark, soft hair. He looked at Lyra over their daughter's head, his face a mask of anguish and hope. The hunter, the survivor, the exiled woman in Lyra warred with the memory of the girl who had loved him. The sight of his brutal justice was horrific, but it was also proof. Indisputable proof. He had not just changed, he had remade himself in fire and blood for her. For them. She took a deep breath, the cold forest air filling her lungs. She slowly, deliberately, narked the arrow from her bow and placed it back in her quiver. She leaned the bow against the wall of her home. The gesture was louder than any words she could have spoken. The heads will draw flies, she said, her voice steady. And beasts. Get rid of them. It was not a yes. It was not forgiveness. But it was not a no. It was a command. An instruction. The first step in a long, uncertain journey back. For the first time in a long, long time, a flicker of something that felt almost like hope ignited in Alaric's desolate heart. He had brought her the pieces of his broken kingdom. Now, perhaps, together, they could begin to build a new one. The thawing was a slow, tentative process, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through a hard, frozen ground. Alaric disposed of the heads, burning them on a pyre deep in the woods, the smoke a grim incense cleansing the air. He did not wear his armor again. He returned to his simple, tattered clothes, to his role as their guardian. But now, the space between them was different. The invisible wall of her anger and his guilt had been breached. He was invited inside for the evening meal. He sat on a low, carved stool by the fire, the king of a vast domain hunched in a tiny, earthen shelter, and it felt more like a home than his castle had in 5 years. Lyra served him a stew of rabbit and wild roots in a rough-hewn wooden bowl. He ate with a reverence that humbled her, as if it were the finest feast. Ilara, now completely unafraid, treated him as a permanent fixture in her life. She would climb into his lap, demanding stories. Alaric, who had only ever read royal histories and war scrolls, found himself fumbling at first. But then he began to speak of the stars, naming the constellations for her. He told her tales of ancient dragons and sea serpents, his deep voice a low rumble in the small shelter. Lyra would watch them from across the fire, her hands busy mending a tunic or sharpening her flint knives, and she would feel the tight knot of her grief begin to loosen, thread by painful thread. One evening, as Ilara slept soundly on her pallet of furs, Alaric spoke into the comfortable silence. I do not deserve your forgiveness, Lyra. I know that. I may never deserve it. Lyra looked up from her work, her needle poised in mid-air. No, she said, her voice soft but honest. You don't. He accepted her words with a nod, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. But I will spend the rest of my eternal life trying to earn it. Whether you return with me or not. Whether you ever speak a kind word to me again or not. My life is sworn to you. To her. That is the only vow that matters to me now. She put her sewing aside. What would be different, Alaric? If we went back? What would truly be different? Everything, he said, his voice raw with conviction. You would not be my consort. You would be queen. Your word would be law, equal to my own. No council, no coven, no ancient tradition would ever stand above you again. I would tear down the whole world for you before I let anyone harm you or question you. He finally looked at her, his silver eyes shining with an intensity that took her breath away. And our daughter would not be hidden away as a half-blood shame. She would be the crown princess of Night Haven, celebrated and loved. She would be the future. A future of both our worlds, united. He was offering her not just a crown, but a revolution. A chance to remake the kingdom that had cast her out in her own image, with her own strength. He was not asking her to fit into his world. He was asking her to help him build a new one. She thought of the years of solitude, of the constant fear, of the fierce, lonely love she had poured into her child. She could stay here. They could survive. But could they thrive? Could Alara ever know the fullness of her heritage, the power that flowed in her veins, in this hidden corner of the world? Alaric was offering their daughter a birthright, one he had stolen and was now desperately trying to return. She will need a teacher, Lyra said, her gaze drifting to her sleeping child. Someone to show her how to control what she is. She will have her father, Alaric said quietly. And her mother. The fiercest hunter and the strongest spirit I have ever known. Together, we will teach her everything. The journey back to the capital was the stark inversion of her exile. She did not walk in rags, alone and shamed. She rode beside Alaric on a fine, grey mare he had brought for her, with Alara seated before him on his great black warhorse, her small hands clutching the pommel of his saddle, her laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. They did not travel as a king and his reclaimed property, but as a family returning from a long and painful war. The capital was in turmoil. The news of the council's execution had thrown the court into chaos. Rumors flew like bats in the twilight. When the royal party arrived at the gates, a hush fell over the city. The people stared as Alaric, the unyielding king, rode through the streets, not with a new, pure-blooded bride, but with the human consort he had exiled 5 years before. And with a child. A child with the king's silver eyes. The throne room was filled with the remaining courtiers, their faces a mixture of fear, shock, and avarice as they wondered how this new power dynamic would play out. Alaric dismounted and lifted Alara from the saddle, setting her gently on her feet. He then turned and offered his hand to Lyra. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. His hand was cool, but his grip was firm, steady. Together, they walked up the long, marbled aisle, their footsteps echoing in the vast, silent hall. Alara walked between them, her small hands holding one of each of theirs. Alaric did not go to the obsidian throne. He stopped before it, turning to face the assembled court. His voice, when he spoke, was not the cold command of a tyrant, but the clear, resonant voice of a transformed man. "You bear witness to a new age," he declared. "For 5 years, this kingdom has been ruled by a broken king, poisoned by lies and crippled by a hollow pride." He looked down at Lyra, his voice softening. "I sent away the best part of myself. The heart of this kingdom. And in my blindness, I nearly destroyed us all." He squeezed Lyra's hand. "No more. Today, the law of blood purity, the law that brought such injustice and pain, is abolished. From this day forward, worth will be measured by character, not by birth." A shocked murmur went through the court. "I present to you Lyra, my wife, your queen." He released her hand, stepped back, and in a move that stunned the entire court into absolute silence, he knelt before her. The king of Night Haven, for the second time, bent his knee to his exiled wife. "My life, my love, my loyalty are yours, now and forever. Rule with me, Lyra. Help me heal this land. Help me be a man worthy of you, and of our daughter." Lyra looked down at the kneeling king, and then out at the sea of astonished faces. She saw the path forward, not as a return to what was, but as a chance to build something entirely new. She looked at Alara, her beautiful, powerful, miraculous child, who gazed up at her with trust and love. This was for her. She placed her hand on Alaric's bowed head. "Rise, my king," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority she had earned in the fire of the wilderness. He rose, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He took the heavy, ornate crown from its pedestal beside the throne. But he did not place it on his own head. He turned to Lyra and, with a reverence that was the culmination of his long penance, he placed the crown of Nighthaven upon her head. It settled in her dark hair, its silver and shadow gems a stark and beautiful contrast. Then, he took his own, simpler circlet and placed it on his head. He took his throne. Lyra, his queen, took the one beside it, an identical throne that had been empty for centuries. Ilara stood before them, a princess of two worlds, the living symbol of a new, stronger line. They were not a fairy tale. They were a story of ruin and redemption, of a love that had been destroyed and painstakingly rebuilt. The scars remained. But as they looked out over their court, no longer as a master and his exile, but as a king and queen, a father and mother, a family, they knew they would rule not with the cold iron of tradition, but with the hard-won wisdom of their shared past. The kingdom had been cleansed of treachery. Now, the healing could begin.